Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to our second day thinking about earthly matters. Yesterday, we had a very fruitful, inspiring, challenging encounter and some mind-blowing realizations about the state of the home we share with the more than human. Today, we will still continue. We will continue our reflections, paying perhaps a little more attention to possible future directions to adjust our thinking and hopefully our behavior as we move ahead. To begin with, to kind of set the tone for the day, I would like to make an offering of indigenous knowledge from ancient Mexico, a place that I work on. In the indigenous language of central Mexico, the Nahuatl, we have a phrase that is pronounced in Xochitl, which means the flower, the song. This semantic couplet represents the core of Nahua philosophy that encompasses, on the one hand, kind of the decay, the notion of decay of life in the idea of the flower that is at the same time all beautiful and encompassing and always in the process of dying. And the expression of that realization through song, through the oral word that is transmitted from generation to generation. So in this idea of in Xochitl, we have basically an interesting path of knowledge that can be very useful in our reflections, I think, about our place and our relationship with the environment. Today we have two speakers who will engage in, I think, very fruitful ways with the matters at hand. And I will introduce them both and then give the word to our first speaker. Kyle Whyte is a Timnick Chair of the Humanities, Associate Professor of Philosophy, and Associate Professor of Community Sustainability at Michigan State University. His research addresses moral and political issues concerning climate policy and indigenous peoples, the ethics of cooperative relationships between indigenous peoples and science organizations, and problems of indigenous justice in public and academic discussions of food sovereignty, environmental justice, and the Anthropocene. His scholarship, he has published very widely on these topics, and his scholarship has appeared in journals such as Climatic Change, Daedalus, Sustainability Science, Hypatia, Synthesis, and Human Ecology. He is also an enrolled member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation. Vera Candiani, who will speak next, is Associate Professor of History at Princeton University. She's a native of Argentina and graduate of UC Berkeley. Vera teaches early modern Latin America, as well as landscape material literacy at Princeton. Her book, Dreaming of Dry Land, Environmental Transformation in Colonial Mexico City, won the Conference for Latin American History's Eleanor Melville Prize for Best Book in Latin American Environmental History. She has two very exciting ongoing projects at the moment. One examines the relationship among commons, class formation and colonization in the early modern Americas, looking particularly at Buenos Aires and New York as case studies. The other deals with wetland desiccation and enclosure in France, England, and Mexico in a very interesting comparative perspective. With that, I would like to turn to Kyle Whyte, who will speak to us today about indigenous science fiction for the Anthropocene, Ancestral Dystopias, and Settler Fantasies. Thank you, Kyle.
Miigwech for the introduction. Yeah, it's good to be here in this area. You know, my tribe, the Potawatomi, our old migration and kind of origin story is that we're actually from out this way, and I've followed the work of the Narragansett tribe for years, and their work has always been inspiring to me, rebuilding that sovereignty in pretty hostile conditions. So, you know, I'm particularly fond of this region, and Brown University with its Native American Indigenous Studies initiative, and Brown has two of my favorite, most admired Indigenous Studies scholars, Dr. Marielena Wambachano and Dr. Elizabeth Hoover. So it's also great to be in that atmosphere as well. For this presentation, what I want to be engaging in are some of the ideas more on the speculative side that I've come to think about through my work in understanding Indigenous peoples' climate change and climate justice issues. And so through the U.S. Global Change Research Program, I've been part of several scientific reports where literally in these reports you look at, up to like hundreds of Indigenous people's testimonies and reports about what they're going through with respect to climate change. And just hearing about, story after story, not just about being concerned with certain impacts like sea level rise, but actually being concerned that the reason why Indigenous people may be vulnerable or threatened by these impacts is because there's still laws and policies that are oppressive and express dominant institutions. And so I have been attending multiple events hosted by Indigenous people to build awareness globally and nationally on climate change issues. And following all of these important precedents that Native people are setting, especially in the legal world, one of the early lawsuits against the fossil fuel industry was by the village of Kivalina. And Indigenous leaders are inspiring and reframing what climate change means. So Sheila Watt-Cloutier saying it's not just avoidance of warming, it's about the right to be cold. And Vicky Tauli-Corpu's special rapporteur on the rights of Indigenous people at the United Nations level has not skimped on saying that climate change is one of the key topics that Indigenous people are facing. And so this is for us, one of the highest levels of human rights advocacy. And in being engaged in all this, and as a Potawatomi person, which we're part of the larger Anishinaabe group, which includes Odawa and Ojibwe people, one of the things that comes out of these discussions is actually for Native people, climate change is not really a new topic for us. For a lot of non-Native people, I'm always hearing about, well, it's the first time that, humans have not only confronted climate change, but climate change that might have been caused by human activities or human collective actions, AK industrialization, capitalism, and how colonialism facilitated those processes. But for a lot of Indigenous people, that's not too surprising for us. So I was mentioning before that for Anishinaabe people, our origin story, our old story, is about being migratory people. And if you have a chance for somebody to go into a bit of detail about how it is we got from the East Coast to the Great Lakes region, it's an entire story of adaptation from one new ecosystem to the next. It's a migratory story. It's a story of constant motion and not what does it mean to be permanent in a place? That's the settler colonial style. But what it means to be in a new place and to make those new relationships with plants, animals, insects, other aspects, dimensions of the ecosystem. And so by the time that we got to the Great Lakes, we developed an entire political philosophy of governance that was based on how do you order your social, political, and cultural institutions to be most adaptive to seasonal change. And so, unlike a lot of political philosophies that I read, where there's not a lot of discussion about the environment, our intellectual traditions of political philosophy were very much about that coupling of human institutions with the non-human world. And so in my studies of our traditions, one of the things I found is that we didn't actually believe that you had the same government all year round or the same set of political institutions. You had many hundreds of political institutions that constantly shifted throughout the year, and that they were designed to be as adaptive and resilient as possible. And we knew at some points that we would have to get rid of institutions that were no longer applicable and create new ones. And so whereas a lot of people think that Native intellectual traditions are all about staying the same and preserving traditions, actually some of our most traditional values are about constant motion and transformation. And when I've looked at our traditions, but also many others, so my friend Shannon McNeely and her collaborators at the Koyukon tribe have constructed this sort of Arctic political philosophy that's seasonal, and many other groups too, the Nez Perce. But when we look at these different ways of thinking about political philosophy, what we find is that moral relationships. And by moral relationships, I mean certain qualities like trust, consent, accountability, were actually the key to how these institutions worked. So, for example, it wasn't this just that political society was organized to adapt to seasonal change, but it was that people thought that a society that was based on high levels of respect for consent was also a society that would be sustainable. And so our traditions are about, for example, creating consent cultures, not just consensus decision-making, but an entire society in which if you're an expert on something like wild rice or sturgeon, not only does the community or nation have to consent to your educational processes by which you become that expert, but then throughout the year there's multiple times, such as giveaway ceremonies, where you actually have to demonstrate how good of a job you're doing, and people again consent to your having that role in society, and they can dissent too. And so if you look at how things are organized, it's a culture of consent. And this also is related to how there was an appreciation of not only gender equality, but gender fluidity as well. The language was also itself very fluid, being almost 70% or more verbs. And I think these are the traditions that are important to think about, that it's not just that we are, as people, associated with intellectual traditions that suggest just one way of doing things, but rather we're very focused on understanding environmental issues as deeply moral issues. Whereas in one of the other fields that I'm part of, in environmental ethics, one of the key challenges is actually to get white people to realize that environmental issues are moral issues. And while I'm not saying that as Native people we have all the answers, we do have different starting points, and it's sad that the starting points we have aren't more represented in the higher education system. So you contrast what I just showed you with how the Environmental Protection Agency looks at our relationships to the environment, and here I don't see any people really. I don't see any moral relationships. I don't see a lot of activity or motion. And so a friend of mine, Megan Bang, does excellent scholarship on what does it mean when kids are exposed to this at a young age? And what would it be like if instead, kids were exposed to, this or this? And so these are important questions that have framed as kind of understand it for Native people, just the idea of climate change and of human society's capacity to cultivate landscapes and to change the environment is one of our oldest ideas, going back to our traditions in political philosophy. Now, there's another kind of human-caused climate change that we've also had to recognize more recently in the last couple hundred years, or for other people, even longer than that. And so Candace Callison, I think, writes it very succinctly, right? That when you think about, well, how do Indigenous people look at the current climate change issue? We actually have to understand that we've been through at least several hundred years of climate change that was forced on us through U.S., Canadian, other forms of colonialism, imperialism, and settlement. And so my tribe, actually, going way back to the 19th century, is among the first climate change refugees in a certain way of talking about it, because we were doing fine in the Great Lakes. In fact, during the fur trade period, Anishinaabe people, in a sense, became stronger and had a period of success. The U.S. wanted Chicago, it wanted Detroit, didn't want to have much to do with us in the Great Lakes region, so we marched all the way down to Oklahoma, ceded territory at this scale, went on the trail of death, ended up here where the U.S. wanted to put every Anishinaabe and many other tribes in the Indian Territory, what's now Oklahoma. And it's literally being forced to shift from one climate region to another climate region. And we had to actually figure out what it would mean to rebuild ourselves in a completely different set of ecosystems, habitats. It's like imposing climate change on us. It's an imposition of different environmental conditions and not enough time to figure out what to do. And actually, many of our ancestors thought that it wouldn't be as bad of an adaptation to colonialism as you might think, because have you all been to Oklahoma before? It's not the prettiest place. And they actually thought, and some of them said that white people would never want to settle Oklahoma. And so it was a pretty doggone good place to go, because who would want to go there? Of course, they struck oil in Oklahoma, then wanted to farm it and set up those nutty agricultural conditions that made folks particularly susceptible to drought in the Dust Bowl. And so again, actually many Native people in Oklahoma, including my tribe, were completely displaced, dispossessed of land to make way for the oil industry, to make way for settler agriculture. And so in that way, right, you experience another kind of human-imposed climate change at multiple levels in this experience in Oklahoma, both having to rebuild yourself from scratch, but then again being colonized within Indian territory. And so you can't really understand Native experiences of what it means to even conceptualize climate change without understanding in detail how we've literally had to rebuild our societies. And so when I was, I guess, a child, and our tribal chairperson talks a lot about this, that was our headquarters. And we just had a few $100s in the bank. And we've had to figure out, how is it that we can protect our citizens and members, create programs, create cultural revitalization, and draw from all this wisdom that we actually got from our Great Lakes heritage. And what does that mean in a place like Oklahoma? And so if you go into the Potawatomi area in Oklahoma, what you'll see actually is we talk about those relationships we developed with plants like corn as part of the governance strategy that we want to implement today. And why is that? Because when you think about Potawatomi relationships to corn, you don't just think about how corn tastes or how nice it is from an aesthetic sense to interact with a traditional plant, but because our corn traditions embody an entire philosophy of moral relationships that, even though we can't sort of repeat exactly how we governed ourselves historically, they suggest these relationships like consent, like that consent culture. But others as well I talk about in my work that we want to have in our current governance form right now. Which, now that Potawatomi people are scattered everywhere, when I got a job at Michigan State University, I wound right back in that area where you see the three triangles that are closest together, and that's our traditional area. And so I was having a fantastic time kind of getting reacquainted and actually learning how to use certain plants and animals and habitats that you get in the Great Lakes that are out of our traditions, but that you're not going to find in Oklahoma, or if you could, you don't have access to it. And then this is what really got me thinking about how for Native people we're just thinking about climate change very different, is a friend of mine at Environmental Protection Agency told me that in 50 years, Michigan was just going to become like Oklahoma in terms of its climate. And you think about it, right, is that for a lot of non-Native people, this might be a bit tricky to understand it. Literally for us, when we think about that, and given the U.S. role in endorsing industrialization and capitalism and the fossil fuel industry, right, that it is kind of like the U.S. is trying to put, every Anishinaabe into Oklahoma, even if that means, expanding the climate of Oklahoma to the Great Lakes region, where there's a few Potawatomi folks left. And this is this kind of consciousness. So for, Indigenous people, climate change arises as, just one part of kind of an ongoing series of colonial-induced environmental and climatic changes that we've had to deal with, and that aren't things that our ancestors would have really thought that we would be dealing with today. But they wouldn't have been surprised either, given what they knew about how human societies relate to the environment. And so if you look at the key issues in climate justice that many Indigenous people are facing today, you can't really understand them without understanding how the United States and other settler colonial nations have refused to change the ultimate laws and policies that make us vulnerable to climate change related issues. So if you followed the Standing Rock Tribe's ceremonies in relation to stopping the Dakota Access Pipeline, the question wasn't, how do you stop the people from building the pipeline, going through Lakota, Dakota land? The issue is, why are there still laws and policies in place that make it possible in the first place for a pipeline builder to non-consensually put a pipeline there. And that there are already 2 pipelines going under that same area. How did we get to that point? And a lot of people didn't recognize that the land theft against Lakota Dakota people in that area was admitted by the US Congress in the early 1980s, and the US actually admitted that that was one of the worst things that the US thought it had ever done. Which says a lot, doesn't it? And so, is it the pipeline itself that is the only problem? Absolutely not. The U.S. has a pending responsibility for well over 100 years to fix what it's continued to fail to want to fix effectively. And if we're thinking about the level of morality, that's again restoring or creating for the first time genuine consent relationships, which are things that we're used to talking about in our traditions of political philosophy. With Native people that are relocating, and so if you ever read another friend of mine's work, Beth Marino, on Shishmaref, but many other scholars who I engage in, is if you look at their work, and I reflected on all these different testimonies I was seeing through some of the work I described earlier about why it is that many Indigenous people are in the position to have to relocate due to sea level rise or another climate change impact in the first place. It's weird because historically, even in fairly recent history, their ancestors wouldn't have thought that sea level rise would have been a problem. And when I looked in more detail at why I kept getting the sense that that was the case, I realized that a lot of the vulnerability stems from the fact that many of these communities live permanently on these little sliver islands. And so if your whole way of life is based on this tiny island, well, yeah, you're totally going to be vulnerable. But historically, that's not really where they lived. They might have inhabited that area for certain parts of the year, but they lived in a much larger area. They were mobile. They followed the seasons. And so sea level rise affecting one area or part of one area, they would have been able to adapt to that. Moreover, they had diplomatic relationships with even more far-flung groups that actually many Indigenous people have today, despite all the technology we have. And they would have been able to broker those deals that would have been needed to be able to move even further away if, in fact, the climate change impacts were that dramatic, necessitating such change. And so why then are so many Indigenous people in these small locations? Well, the U.S. wanted to use the Arctic. Canada wanted to use the Arctic. Canada and the U.S. wanted to use our lands, and so they wanted to put us in small areas out of the way, put residential schools and boarding schools and post offices and other things to create that sense of permanence. And so in this way, the U.S. still hasn't figured out, if we're thinking about Alaska, a better, more ethical type of political relationship with Indigenous people. And until that happens, we're not going to actually be able to deal with certain types of climate change vulnerability. But there's the deja vu in other senses too, because if you look at just the scale of the pipeline industry in the United States, and the more pipelines they build, the more extraction that happens, we see some of the familiar signs that colonialism hasn't really changed, right? Whenever you have a extractive industry area, you have the man camps, and if you've ever read the work of Sarah Deer, which is very important work, she shows pretty soberly that in the man camps, it's Indigenous women, girls, two-spirit persons that are trafficked in the sex trade. And for us, right, if you notice, if you follow Indigenous environmental movements, we actually think that the sexual violence in the extractive industry and the environmental violence of the extractive industry are just one and the same problem. And so you see a lot of Indigenous environmental activism talking about issues of sexual violence, gender fluidity, gender equality, and environmental advocacy and stewardship. Now, why would we just think those are the same things, right? Because if our traditions are all about consent cultures, both extraction on Indigenous lands and sexual violence are issues of consent. A society like the United States, whose institutions have almost no respect for consent at all, no matter how you want to describe consent, are ones in which you're going to have rampant sexual violence. You're going to have rampant harassment. You're going to have extractive, environmentally degrading industries. And so for us, when we speak about these issues to a lot of non-Indigenous people, we oftentimes have to do that translation. But if I'm talking, say, to another Native person and they're talking about sexual violence, I know they're talking about environmental issues too. And so here again, we see that for us, the types of injustices associated with climate change and the drivers of climate change are too familiar to us, because as many folks who studied history know, sexual violence has always been a tool of US and Canadian colonialism in many, many different forms. And if you think about then the situation that we're in, and this is what a lot of non-Native people don't know about, is that in the last 200 years, having gone through all of this massive environmental degradation and destruction, we have our own stories of exactly how we survived it. And so I do a lot of work with the Menominee tribe, especially their Sustainable Development Institute there. And they have an incredible story of how they went from millions of acres across Wisconsin, parts of Michigan, Illinois, other areas in the Great Lakes, and were reduced to that little box. And so they're not Anishinaabe people, but they're a related group, and their seasonal lifestyle was ended almost instantly in the 19th century. But they took those same moral values that were part of their ancestors' way of life, and they figured out, how is it going to work in this little box? And so they created a non-monocrop commercial forest, which is now well known as an early precedent of sustainable forestry, where the forest actually plays the role, you can see it from outer space, of supporting cultural life and social life, spiritual life, ceremonial life, in addition to being pretty good for jobs. And so that spiritual agential value of the forest for them as an ecosystem, as a set of kinship and relative relationships, is part of what's allowed them to continue not only to survive, but in some senses also to flourish, despite having been through an attempted genocide that many human groups have not been able to overcome, right? And accurately so. That is not something that, anybody, any society wants to have to go through. And so at the Sustainable Development Institute there, they've tried to think through what allowed them to adapt. And so they've created a sustainability model using scientific and Indigenous principles. You can analyze some pretty complex stuff using visual cues through thinking through this model. And it's these stories, right, of how Indigenous people have survived recent human-caused climate change that tell you a lot about how we think about the situation that we're in. Is that we're our ancestors to have known that we'd be living in a situation where pretty much anybody could build a pipeline through your land, where you'd be shrunk to a fraction of the area of land you had access to. That's a dystopian situation, right? And so we're already starting out right now in a dystopian situation where we've literally seen the destruction of relationships to plants and animals that you could argue is far worse than anything that white people fear will happen with respect to climate change, right? Literally like 95, 99% even of plants and animal species that we interacted with are gone in a very short period of time. And I actually haven't seen climate change projections, except for some of the most extreme. They didn't even say that will happen to non-native people. And so if you look at Indigenous science fiction, and Dennis Goulet's film Wakening, which you can find on YouTube, is an excellent expression of Indigenous science fiction. If you look at some of the themes, right, it's not about preparing for a future dystopia that we might fear will happen, but rather it's about thinking about what those moral relationships are that we need today to be able to survive the present dystopia. And in particular, who are the protagonists going to be that will break us out of the matrix, that will break us out of this box-like existence we have in a landscape of degradation? And so in this film, for example, there are two characters, two protagonists that work together, and they don't have to understand each other's agency. One is a female character, one is a non-human character. And no different from, in a sense, the Menominee, who their protagonist was the forest itself and all of its relatives. These protagonists have an amazing potential to support our community restoration and community building in light of completely adverse decisions or situations. And so we're living in a time where we're in this dialogue constantly with our ancestors about what lessons would they have taught us about how we can survive today's times. And so a lot of Indigenous philosophy is precisely a dialogue where we talk in very complicated ways about how different generations of our ancestors would have thought about this particular time and brainstorm about what it is that they would have thought was the best thing to do, given how horrified they would have likely been about how in such a short time things had gotten this bad. And so in my work in education, such as the Tribal Climate Camp, it's hosted by several tribes, or it's been hosted by several tribes. This one was at Nez Perce. We've been hosted by the Nisqually. A lot of what we're doing in these events to try to figure out how to prepare for climate change is figure out who those protagonists are going to be. Figuring out, who those non-human agents are going to be that have that special power, and learning about how tribes can, provide the conditions and the support to create that type of empowerment. So these are from the Nisqually version. But, in our educational models, I've looked at the best way to describe it is it's not about like lecturing like I'm doing now or talking. It's not simply about discussion too, right? But it's about building out those kind of science fiction solutions to the problems that we face. And so a lot of the tribes I work with, precisely what they think is the basis of their climate change planning are going back to these schemas. This is from the Nez Perce tribe, their cosmologies, their overall sets of understandings of moral relationships, and then figuring out how to re-empower and re-energize those in our contemporary times. And so I think the idea of Indigenous, science fiction, refers to these overall processes that involve education, political advocacy, environmental knowledge. And this is why in our language, in Anishinaabe language, we have these terms that a lot of non-native people don't get, like anikubijigan, which literally is like ancestor and descendant, it's just the same word. Because you're always in dialogue at that intergenerational level, right? There's not a distinction. And in my discussions with Sherry Kopanes and Dylan Miners, a colleague at Michigan State, this is what it's about, right? Thinking about that type of philosophical dialogue and discussion. And when I travel around the world, like in the Pacific, for example, these notions of spiraling time, of cyclical time, but that doesn't exclude, linear time, are very important. And so whether it's the work of Kepa Morgan or my friend Tanya Wolfgram or Linda Smith, right, it's all about this kind of spiraling time and as a way of thinking about the types of philosophical dialogues that we need to break us out of these situations that we're facing. And so for me, right, climate change is really, it's about back to the future. It's not fear of the future. And it's about renewing, not only creating new relatives, but restoring old relatives. And it's about our collective continuance, our adaptive capacity, our resilience. And it's about not only focusing on the types of relationships we want, like a type of relationship being like a responsibility, but the qualities associated with that. So like consent, trust. And this is kind of what Indigenous science fiction's about, because we see this as empirical, we see this as ethical, moral, political, ceremonial. Of course, this is what I'll just close with. When non-native people talk about us in relation to concepts like the Anthropocene, and there's a couple of recent papers, one in the Decolonized issue of Yes magazine, where I go kind of, radical Indian on folks, and then another paper that I'm going to try to publish at some point, which has a similar title to this talk. I found, when a lot of non-native people talk about the Anthropocene, it's all about the fear of like a future apocalypse and fear of a future dystopia, and talking about a time of rationing and, extinctions and, all this types of stuff, right? Logics of apocalypse, and even, Audra Mitchell does really fantastic work, documenting some of these views. This idea of, we're headed for like this catastrophe. It could even lead to the extinction of all humans. And so, like I said earlier, for a lot of Native people, this is, funny just because, we've been through like multiple apocalypses and are coming out of them and in a current dystopia, at least from the standpoint of our ancestors. And so hear this, you're kind of thinking, well, what's missing in the ways that they are talking about it? And so, I looked at some of the discourse on the Anthropocene that referenced Indigenous people. And so this is some essays that came from a 2014 colloquium called 1,000 Names of Gaia. And the organizers wrote this kind of thematic paper. The best part, of course, is which they referred to Indigenous people as autochthonous. That's another issue. But they said climate change is the final offensive against us. And for them, it's high time to make room for the perspectives of others. And so I was like, if you're thinking about like a tribe like the Menominee or some of the others I have described, if somebody else is telling you like that climate change is the last, offensive against you, and that, what does that mean given all that we've survived, or that now it's high time to make room for Indigenous perspectives? In other cases, I was looking at some other scholars that kept sort of referring to Indigenous people as still kind of occupying a space that was untouched by the Anthropocene, and that climate change threatened to even take away that space. And so this author, Havaman, describes this kind of perspective, and then Salick and Ross too, this idea that the Anthropocene is spreading to the final untouched sort of Indigenous Holocene environment. And so in looking at all these different quotes, what I realized is that these aren't ancestral dystopias, they're actually ancestral fantasies. And it's a highly problematic form of allyship because it's suggesting that actually Indigenous people do not live under conditions of colonialism, at least not all of them, and that there's still a chance for non-native people to do what their ancestors failed to do. There's still an opening that hasn't yet been affected by colonialism. There's still a time just before the final onslaught of climate change that non-native people could do something to stop climate change from having that impact. And what these sort of ancestral fantasies are is the idea that the world that their ancestors set up is one where they could say, the current generation of allies could say these things and feel that they were on moral ground, even though none of the things I quoted reference the importance of decolonization, of changing political relations, of changing moral relations, and that one could offer ideas for solutions that will have no impact on Indigenous people and feel that they're on strong moral ground for doing so. And while our ancestors would have looked at today's times as dystopian, their ancestors would say, that's fantastic, that's what we fantasized about. All those native people we couldn't conquer 200 years ago, our more conservative descendants can put pipelines in, and our more liberal descendants can then think that they still have a chance to save Indigenous people who are untouched by colonialism, which is the biggest settler myth that I see, at least. And so I think that this strategy then, for thinking about allyship, and this is just the last thing I want to mention, is critical, that allies have to get out of these settler fantasy worlds in which the key part of history is their time, which is for us a very small period of time, and our thinking is across hundreds and hundreds of years. And we're in a dystopia that's one little part of that, and we have an ongoing cyclical and fluid history. They're always trying to stuff us in these times and put us in the Holocene and suggest that they can do what their ancestors failed to do. Good to connect with everybody. I look forward to talking further with folks throughout the rest of the event. Miigwech.
I'm not as eloquent as Kyle, by the way, so I will read. And I have no pretty pictures either, so too bad for you. I want to talk about the costs of environmental history, and I realize that I'm not in a forum of environmental historians, but rather of people who have most likely identified themselves as part of the humanities, writ large. So I want to start by following Astrida's notions of politeness yesterday when she said that it was a polite thing to do to say who you are and where you come from. I'm from Argentina. I'm also an agglomeration of cells that happen to be programmed to be in tandem with the programmed with circadian rhythms which follow the turns of the Earth around the sun. And I'm also probably about 90% water. I'm not sure any of that matters, though. So what does matter for today's purposes is that I'm a historian. And I'm a historian of early modernity with a specialization in Latin America and a pretty deep empathy for medieval and antique history, as well as economic and social history, evolutionary history, and historical ecology. I'm pretty sure about all of this, of my identity as a historian and of a historian of that particular specialization, and I wear those monikers pretty comfortably. I've also been called an environmental historian, and about that I am less sure and actually a bit uncomfortable, as I am about whether history is actually in the humanities. So what I'd like to say today, what to do today, is to lay out before you some of the reasons for my discomfort, posing to you, who come from a range of disciplines within or kindred to the humanities, the problems that have been rumbling and making a lot of noise in my head lately. I'm going to treat you as my collective therapist, in other words, or hopefully not. These problems revolve around what have been the costs and benefits of the rise and institutionalization of the field of environmental history, whether environmental history has a peculiar mission to fulfill towards the practice of history writ large in our epoch, and how this particular compartmentalization of environmental inquiry has affected our thinking about human time, evolutionary time, geologic time, and the relationship of these multiple pasts to the present and future. So I'm going to offer my still very disorganized thoughts about some of this through the environmental gaze in Latin America and among Latin Americanists. To some, but not to me or to several other Latin American practitioners, as I will explain very shortly, environmental history of and Latin America is a new field, young relative to its counterparts in the United States and Europe. The Latin American and Caribbean Society for Environmental History, or SOLCHA, after its name in Spanish, which was formed barely 12 years ago, following the model of the U.S. American Society for Environmental History, which was founded in 1977, and of the European Society for Environmental History, which was founded in 1999 with a particular Germanic influence. For scholars who affiliate with the view that the field is new, a lot has been accomplished since the foundation of SOLCHA in 2006. Balance sheets have proliferated since then by scholars that include the Colombian Claudia Leal, the Brazilian José Augusto Padua, the Argentine Carlos Reborati, and the North Americans John Saluri and Mark Carey, who have all pointed out the multiplication of Latin American environmental history publications in this time, the ever-expansion of their geographic coverage and of topics, the deepening of empirical knowledge, and the strong engagement with the problematics of imperialism and colonialism, which our North American and European counterparts more reluctantly embrace for their regions. I agree with these writers that these are very clear and resounding beneficial effects of the institutionalization of the new field of environmental history in Latin America. When Mark Carey looked back at the field, and this was way back in 2009, he saw then trends in Latin American history that have continued, healthy trends. For instance, studies that have begun to supersede the borders of the modern nation states to take on transnational analyses or non-national analyses, and this in two principal ways. One has been the tracing of the movement of extractive commodities. Sterling Evans's work on the movement of henequen from the Yucatan Peninsula to the sites of North American agribusiness is a good example, as is John Soluri's work on the movement of bananas from the Central American plantations to the North American countertops. The other way that national frontiers have been analytically superseded has traced resources and ecologies, such as water, which is the case of Carey's own work. As importantly, he works on glaciers, but that's frozen water. As importantly, Carey pointed out how studies took on both the production side of the material environmental equation and the consumption one, and how there was also a solid vein of research on cultural environmental topics. So far, so good. Then came his criticisms, and I will return to those shortly. But before, I have to talk about how other Latin American and Latin Americanist scholars have actually recoiled a bit from the idea that Latin American environmental history is a new phenomenon. Historians and geographers such as Alejandro Tortolero Villaseñor, a Mexican specialist on hydraulic and land use topics, Angus Whyte, a scholar of agricultural history, Carlos Reborati again, who works on the urban environmental history of Buenos Aires, and Stefania Gallini, who works out of the Universidad de los Andes in Colombia on methodological problems, have all pointed out just how naive it is to represent the historical gaze on human ecosystem relationships in Latin America as something new. For these folks, it is a mistake to assume an absence of this optic in Latin America and about Latin America before the influence of US environmental history and the institutionalization of Solcha. They have all pointed out how, despite environmental history constituting a field of recent formalization, in reality, the study of environmental interactions of human societies in Latin America is actually quite old and emerged from a variety of disciplines, not just history. Among the disciplinary sources of this Latin American environmental optic are the geography and historical ecology of a Carl Sauer, for example, or the Berkeley School tradition in historical demography and Latin American history, as well as the many Latin American national schools of ethnology, anthropology, archaeology, and related disciplines, all of which predate the American Society for Environmental History by decades, and which gave us the great analysts of historical relationships between ecosystems as humans, such as the Catalan-Mexican anthropologist Ángel Palerm and his disciples in Mexico, who studied the longue durée from pre-Columbine times to the more recent past. Many of us in Latin America also acknowledge the roots of our practice in the French Annales school of Histoire Totale and of the longue durée of a Lucien Febvre, of a Marc Bloch, of a Fernand Braudel, and in the historical and dialectical materialism of the Marxist tradition. Both these traditions analyze the relationships between humans and nature, as well as the relationships of humans within their ecosystems as fundamental to social, economic, political, cultural, and ideological formations. And also both approaches left their deep imprint on beyond Latin America too, as we can see, for example, in the work of the Indian Ramachandra Guha. But they left a far weaker mark on the historical métier as a whole in the United States, and oddly too on environmental history as it is practiced here. And this is odd because, in fact, foundational figures of US environmental history, such as Donald Worster or Alfred Crosby, recognize their debt to the Annales school. And yet the field as a whole seems to have forgotten this. But not that surprising, actually, given the hegemony of liberalism in US academia. Both the Annales and Marxist approaches made big impact on historians in the Spanish-speaking world, particularly but not exclusively in Mexico, Argentina, and Spain. Marxist approaches are quite old in the continent, both inside and outside the academy, with a healthy presence in the founding of social movements and political parties. The Annales, meanwhile, arrived in two waves in Latin America. One was through the exile of Spanish historians who had trained with the analysts in France and had gone into exile, especially to Mexico, after the defeat of the Second Republic in 1939, the Second Spanish Republic in 1939. The second wave was after Latin American exiles started arriving in droves in Paris in the 1970s, training there and then training others upon their return to Latin America in the late 1980s in the methods of the Analyst School. Heirs of these traditions are innumerable. I would spend days rattling their names off, and include scholars such as Juan Carlos Garavaglia, who recently died to our great pain, who worked, among other topics, on the long evolution of Argentine agrarian history, or Antonio Elio Brailovsky and Dina Fogelman, whose 1991 Memoria Verde, now in its 12th edition, was a pioneer of environmental history long before many of the Solcha scholars had graduated from Kinder. The point I'm trying to make is not a patriotic one of we were first in environmental history or environmental analysis. Rather, it is all to point out how in Latin America there are on the one hand new generation scholars who identify as environmental historians and who demonstrate a strong esprit de corps and intellectual identity as such, and a will to develop the field and its sociability. And on the other hand, a good number of scholars, among whom I include myself, who come to environmental history after working in ways that today would be identified as belonging to that field, but who manifest a bit of discomfort in the face of the elevation of environmental history as something shiny, exciting, and new. I think this discomfort comes not from any offense taken by the claim to novelty itself, or from the way that recent Latin Americanist environmental historians sometimes mention their analyst and Marxist predecessors in the continent without actually engaging with their work. But it comes rather from the consequences of not truly knowing and incorporating the roots I just described fully and deliberately into what Latin American history is now, environmental history is now. To merely mention Latin America's own intellectual traditions, imported as they may be, in the historical gaze of the environment, to only claim the scholars in this tradition as environmental historians avant la lettre, is not the same as actively using the lessons legated to us by these scholars, people such as Ángel Palerm that I mentioned before, the Garavaglias, the Brailovskis, the Sergio Buarque de Holanda, who wrote the masterpiece of The Roots of Brazil, also quite old publication, still vigente. How do you say vigente? In print and intellectually active. And social historians and anthropologists who took the environmental question very seriously, such as John Murra, thanks to whom we have the concept of ecological niches as the organizational heart of Andean societies. Thinking about where we are today with environmental history as a whole, given this past, I'd like to point out three key deficiencies in our field that could be having an impact, I don't know because I'm not in the humanities, but could be having an impact on the environmental humanities as well. The first deficiency or challenge, if we want to be positive about it, is temporal. I think that one of the consequences of this sort of distant respects that recent Latin American historians of the environment sometimes pay to their predecessors is a manifestation of what the geographer Andrew Sluter calls recentism, which is the pronounced tendency of environmental historians active today anywhere to focus on topics of the 20th century or the 19th century at the earliest. This focus is legitimate, actually, if what one wishes to understand and explain is the correlation among humans, nature, and the nation state. But this very short gaze, this courte durée, if you want, necessarily misses slower processes in the longue durée, such as desertification, desiccation, forest succession and regeneration, demographic fluctuations, or the complex and actually slow process of colonization, as distinct from the relatively rapid one of conquest, which also usually transcend the political boundaries of colony to republic and of those of the modern nation states. This short gaze is the opposite of what the incredible and up to now inimitable, in my opinion, Warren Dean accomplished with his his book With Broadaxe and Firebrand, which traced the slow emergence of Brazil at the expense of the Atlantic forest from the first humans who settled there to the recent past. It's the opposite, too, of what I tried to do for Mexico in my 2014 Dreaming of Dry Land that Edith was kind enough to mention. And here, of course, you have to forgive the self-promotion. We have truly good modern environmental histories, in other words, but which don't always really go too much in depth. Precisely because with such a short gaze, we necessarily miss many important ecological processes. In general, in post-Solcha Latin American environmental history, the colonial period, not to mention the pre-Columbian era, are at best used as background for that which truly matters, which is the protagonism of actors that are recognizable because they are modern and just like us. This temporal deficiency actually goes beyond Latin America, I think, and seems to me is especially pronounced in the Anglophone and German environmental historical scholarship, to the extent that I know those scholarships, and possibly too in the environmental humanities. So that might be a question that historians and environmental humanities share to explore. A second detrimental effect for Latin American environmental history of this lack of organic rooting in our own intellectual and historiographical traditions was pointed by Mark Carey in his 2009 evaluation of the field, and still holds true. Carey then pointed out that the new version of Latin American environmental history emerged from, and, save for some laudable exceptions, remains moored in three problematics. Those problematics of capitalism, those of imperialism, and those of conservation, along with themes such as that focus on the deterioration, and depredation as preponderant themes, and the nation-state as the analytical unit of analysis. As the analytical unit. Most works published on the environmental history of the continent do not transcend these limits, and too frequently center on the tension between conservation and expoliation, a trend reinforced perhaps by the impulse to orient scholarship to environmental justice in the present. I'd like to quote Carey's question about this because I think it is valid not just for historians, but for the environmental humanities in general to consider. He asked, and I quote, "Are these tales of colossal failure, of environmental tragedy and mismanagement, and of the foreign pillaging of Latin America the primary stories we want to be telling the world about the region? Do such depictions of environmental degradation and crisis, usually caused by Europeans and North Americans, deny Latin Americans' own place in their own past?" And he added, in a way that is applicable more broadly again, "And aren't there other ways humans interact with environments besides deforesting them, eroding them, polluting them, destroying them, and on occasion saving them?" Close quote. I think that in Latin Americanist, North American, and to a lesser extent European environmental studies, these deficiencies persist. Again, with some laudable exceptions. I'm thinking here of a Matthew Witz, who just published a magnificent work on the quotidian relationships among humans and their environments and the state in Mexico, or Michael Wolff at Stanford, again, a Mexicanist and also a modernist, by the way. We have a long way, I think, to overcome these problems too. More problems. The third deficiency that is related to the lack of organic rootedness in the longue durée, totalizing and socio-ecosystemic gaze of our Latin Americanist intellectual predecessors, is the confusion between environmentalism as an activist agenda and socio-environmental analysis and as an empirical and epistemological agenda. Not too long ago, another environmental historian, Emily Wakefield, who is a prominent historian of Mexico who works on forests and whose work I do admire, argued something that I admire a bit less. Quote, going forward, scholars should continue to find and fuse environmental history and environmental justice studies and refrain from letting distinctions among subfields conceal rich thematic harmony. I agree with a lot in that, but I also think that there is a huge risk in that suggestion, in that it basically answers Carrie's last question with a resounding and devastating no. That is, that a corollary of Wakefield's recommendation could be that if, God forbid, humans relate to and within nature in ways that are neither exfoliating nor destructive, nor conservationist and thus positive, then these interactions must necessarily be completely secondary in importance for scholarship, if they merit any study at all. Of course, Wakefield didn't intend such a conclusion, and that's probably the product of my wild imagination. But regardless, the normative suggestion that activism be at the center of historical work risks excluding from analytical curiosity and inquiry anything that is not about the various struggles for human justice, that is not about popular action, that is not about acts of resistance, and so on. One danger of this is that such narrowing of inquiry and research also can become a huge analytical obstacle in cases where human justice contradicts the requirements for life of other animal or plant species, or even of other human groups, a contradiction which is rapidly accelerating and multiplying. What, for example, are we to do analytically when it is the oppressed who who, seeking equality and justice in access to natural resources, destroy ecosystems? Or what do we do analytically when, in satisfying human rights, such as the apparently sacrosanct human right to reproduction or the right to culture that Kyle referred to, when those rights and the struggle for those rights contradicts and comes at the direct expense of the basic requirements of ecosystems? What are we supposed to do analytically with that? Isn't centering historical inquiry on the issue of human environmental justice an example of what Warren Dean called species narcissism? I think it is, because it puts human needs ahead those of the remainder of the biome, given that it is all about putting history, or the humanities if you wish, at the service of the self-proclaimed rights of humans over nature, not within nature. It kind of reminds me of medieval and early Renaissance cartography and how it placed Jerusalem at the spatial center of the maps. And it also reminds me of the philosophical logic behind geocentrism in contradiction with heliocentrism. That is, it is thinking about humans non-environmentally as a civilization and a species with a special destiny and right to survival, which I don't think they have. The irony is that scholars such as Murra, Palerm, Garavaglia, and their respective generations were profoundly committed to the most progressive social and political causes of their epochs, often, unlike sometimes ourselves, at risk of their own lives and through stints in prison and exile, without making these causes the topic and universe of their studies. On the contrary, their work really showcases the impulse to search for the profound causes of present realities in order to better explain and change the logic of those realities in the present and the future. So the challenge is how to create a useful history, a useful environmental humanities, even without the obligations that it be activist. That is, the challenge is to take the activism out of the analysis in order to make the analysis better serve the activism. At stake for me is the overcoming of the limitations that now constrain environmental scholarship in the humanities and social sciences, and most especially that which is done in history. Now, I don't want to give the impression that all of the negative aspects of Latin American environmental history and of the field more broadly, perhaps, are only a consequence of the lack of organic rootedness in and of deliberate tapping into the traditions of the continent's environmental historical gaze. They might also be the result of the circumstances under which environmental history was born. I'm referring to the moment in which the new field of environmental history emerged in North America. It was at the same time as a cultural turn. The American Society for Environmental History took shape in the 1980s, precisely when the political and intellectual disbandment of what little remained of historical materialism, of Marxism in the United States, was underway, and when both politics and intellectual life became increasingly centered on the study of the self, on the individual, on identities, on very legitimate themes of sexuality, gender, and race, in part as a response to the neglect for those topics that traditional political, social, and economic history had incurred. This cultural turn, I think, initially produced work that stretched the historiographical horizon in content, in theory, in methods, in empirical findings. But I'm not sure that this initial revitalization of scholarship has been sustained. Yes, there are more studies that have been produced on these topics, and we have learned more and more about the intricacies of historical cultural relations in all corners and times of the continent. But I wonder to what extent each new study on gender, race, resistance, or identity modifies and advances upon the history and dynamics traced in the pioneering works of those fields, or whether what we are seeing is the replication of the original a myriad times as in a mirror gallery. And I ask myself exactly the same question about environmental history. How far has it truly gone in explaining historical human ecosystem relations? Importing the North American institutional and historiographical model for Latin America's own approach to the relationship between humans and nature and of humans within nature has had big costs, I think. Our North American counterparts in environmental history, or even perhaps, I don't know, in the environmental humanities, do not see their intellectual roots in Latin American scholarship at all. In historical materialism, yeah, sometimes. Or in the Annales School, well, yeah, maybe. Or even in the Berkeley School and Carl Sauer. I have the impression that in institutionalizing our own environmental history following the model of the American Society of Environmental History, we have erected Bill Cronin, Alfred Crosby, Donald Hughes, and J.R. McNeill as the canon for environmental historical scholarship, instead of making them part of the canon. And in doing so, Latin Americanists have unnecessarily constrained our own methodological, theoretical, and empirical archive. The flip side of the coin of all this is that in creating a distinct field apart from what Carlos Reborati calls the hard nucleus of history, political, social, and economic history, environmental history has had the negative effect of relieving practitioners of these other forms of history from the need to take nature and socio-ecosystems and conditions limitations seriously, and not treat them as a mere backdrop, as they continue to do. That is, with the existence of socio-environmental specialists, social, economic, and political historians seems to have felt exempt from the need to root their considerations in the physical, evolutionary, and biological world, and seem to have felt free to fantasize that the processes and phenomena they analyze have nothing to do with the ecologies in which they take place. The total effect is the drastic curtailment of the utility of history for the environmental and civilizational challenges of our epoch. In my view, this is the cost of having erected environmental history as a separate field. And I wonder if in creating an environmental humanities, we won't be having the same effect, or you won't be having the same effect, since I'm not in the humanities. All of which lead me to wonder if it is not time to dissolve the separation of environmental history from the hard nucleus of history, in ways similar to how Emanuel Wallerstein proposed reintegrating the scientific and social disciplines in his 2004 Uncertainties of Knowledge, which built upon his earlier essay on the structures of knowledge and the construction of the disciplines. What I haven't thought about, since, again, I'm not a humanist, is whether this reintegration should extend to the humanities as well. That's the end of the noise in my head that I wanted to transmit to you, and hopefully it hasn't been too weird. You want some water?
I'm good. Thanks for offering.
It is.
Sí, gracias. Thank you very much, Vera and Kyle, for those really thought-provoking and kind of shaking talks. I believe we could take 20 minutes for Q&A. If you agree, we can have a slightly shorter lunch break. And shall we start here with Sharon? Oh, yeah, okay.
Thanks so much for a fascinating set of papers. Kyle, I have two questions for you. The first is about, I'm very interested in the moral relations with the non-human that you're talking about, and I was particularly struck by your very brief reference to corn. And so I wanted to just ask you to, or invite you to say a little bit more about how the moral relationship to corn is envisioned in the tribes that you're familiar with, and particularly with respect to things like consent and trust. That's another word you mentioned in that connection. And then the second thing is about, I wonder if you could give us some examples of different sorts of political institutions for different seasons.
Yes.
Because I thought that was also really interesting, and I'd like to hear more about that.
Great. Well, thanks for your question. I appreciate it. So on the first question, so what's interesting about, sort of corn economies was the idea that this is just one idea, but the idea that, corn in all of its forms throughout the year would be involved in the society in multiple ways. Whether it was for nourishment, for exercise, as a marker of leadership, trusted leadership, as a type of something that would associate with the knowledge production systems. And so what comes out of that, and I've been citing some literatures, I think are some of the only ones that go into detail on this, but not on corn, but other relationships like with salmon for other tribes. But for Anishinaabe people in particular, there are very careful protocols on who gets to be like a corn steward. And a lot of different checks and balances that ensure accountability. So like in the United States, we're constantly having this debate about whether people that produce scientific knowledge are accountable to anybody. And one level of that is the skepticism that some people have. But even people who aren't skeptic about science have trust issues with science, which is why there's been a movement for community-based research and other types of research that might be more accountable. And so for our tribe, for example, one of the ways in which we translated this kind of idea of like the corn economy was we realized that under the current system of federally recognized tribes, that most of the dollars that come into our tribe through different businesses just flow out and other non-native people make money off of it. And that we actually don't trust people in leadership because we didn't design the leadership institutions that currently govern us. They're ones that we were sort of had to make due to some trade-offs that occurred earlier in the 20th century. And so the corn economy suggested an idea, and our tribal leadership talks a lot about this, about a system where it's like you control all of the supply chain in a certain sense, right? You know, whether it's through your business portfolio, through making sure that you produce things that you sell and consume. And so in kind of contemporary, like Oklahoma capitalism, it created a model for thinking about a way of engaging in tribal enterprise, where you know where things came from, you know who is responsible for them, and you had higher levels of of trust, and I would even say consent. So that's the short answer for that.
So is the trust then only among humans? The trust and the consent is operating among humans, not between the human and the non-human?
Well, I would say that it is, though one of the things I think you see in a lot of Indigenous philosophical discussions, I think consent is a good example of this, is that I can say that like another human could consent, but it's unclear whether like non-humans offer or experience consent in the same way. And so actually I think this is why a lot of Native traditions and institutions keep a kind of openness and criticality to them about about what it means to engage intimately using morals that we're not quite sure whether they make sense for the non-human world. In some of my work on food sovereignty, what I've tried to show, though I wouldn't necessarily say it this way, is that by being ultra respectful of the idea that trust and consent may be important, but we're not quite sure whether the non-human world can reciprocate, that if you rally your community around that particular goal and sort of embrace the problematic about it, that can then help rebuild the moral relationships within your society that would allow you to actually adapt if it turned out that people were treating corn bad. And this is like the importance of continuance, right? Is that, or this idea of continuance, is that what we're trying to do is build a moral fabric so that when we find out that we have been messing with the environment, it doesn't create more social conflict than we can handle, like you have in the United States. And this is different from, say, identifying a sustainable practice with corn and just trying to sort of replicate that. And I don't want to go on too much on this because, for us, and I've written a bit about this recently in Indigenous environmental education, one of the key topics in traditional environmental education is the way in which we've interpreted a lot of traditions has brought with it sort of a strange gender binary, as well as a strange kind of gendered sense of how to interact with certain plants and animals. And given how heteropatriarchy has been heavily imposed on tribal communities, that if we don't have a kind of openness to inclusivity and difference, that our societies are currently not at a stage where we'll be able to handle that type of conflict. And so I think this is kind of a theme in my work about why these moral qualities like inclusivity, like accountability, like consent, like trustworthiness are primarily about having that adaptive capacity to prevent certain types of harms from happening as we deal with challenges that may be unexpected or as we deal with the fact that we may be wrong. So Native people sometimes ding me for saying things like, I can envision a time when Native people are vegetarians. Well, why not? It's perfectly consistent with our traditional values. Just quickly on the other part of your question, which I really appreciate. Yeah, absolutely. So during some times of the year, like for Anishinaabe people, like maple harvesting, the political authority is the nuclear family. Whereas during like fishing and berrying seasons, it's the larger band and chief structure. And one of the things you see in some really emerging important history like Michael Wittgen or even work to a degree like Brenda Child and others is that what we know historically is that people had super diverse identities. Like it wouldn't have made sense for somebody to identify as Potawatomi or as a particular name. People might actually have like over 100 identities that depended on different seasonal responsibilities. And so even my tribe just refers to a particular type of political formation. And you can see Europeans and Americans struggling with this when they identified Native people because they didn't encounter the fire people or the beaver people. So that this referred to that particular week. Right? And that was a key part of these institutions too, is you'd be a member of lodges, clans. And people used to sign treaties with their clan, symbol as well. And a clan can be very fluid as well, having different seasonal responsibilities. So, it's a pretty complex question, but Regna Darnell that Michael Wittgen cites calls it an accordion system of government. We were expanding and contracting. And some people say that was a strategy to dealing with the fallout of the fur trade, was the ability to shrink or expand into smaller, bigger societies, depending on what colonialism was doing. Thanks for your question.
Yeah. It makes sense because it's the, I mean, this might be pushing you in a direction that you don't want to go, and I don't want to take up the time, but it seems coherent with what is the basic unit of production. If it's the family unit that is going out to topic, or the community as a whole that also changes seasonally.
No, that's right. That's right. What size?
Macarena has a question over here. I think we can hope keep the others a tiny bit shorter so we can have more of them if you agree. Macarena, please.
So I'll try to be brief because for me this was a dreamy panel as a Latin Americanist, Latin American who works on indigeneity, to think with the two of you on this question. I'll try to be brief. I have a lot of questions. I'm really interested in thinking about the ways, Vera, potentially that we could think about not just a wholesale kind of abandonment of certain forms of North American knowledge production or disciplinary strains and being kind of adopted into a Latin American canon, but perhaps the kind of other dimensions. So for me, U.S. critical indigenous studies has been very key to opening up questions within the Americas that has allowed, me to understand certain kinds of Mapuche militant struggles, say in Chile and Argentina, in ways that Latin Americanist scholarship hadn't attended to at the time. So without a certain U.S. critical indigenous studies, I wouldn't have been able to do certain kinds of work on those issues. So that's one thing. I guess I'm wondering what indigenous studies could or could not do to put the two of you in conversations to ameliorate some of the, the deficiencies that you see with environmental histories. And on the other hand, I'm interested in the ways that kind of knowledge can travel the other way around. Say, I've noticed, for instance, Glenn Coulthard's work, which is really important work in Marxist critique and bringing Marxism and indigenous studies together, right, from a DNA Canadian perspective. But recently hearing him on trying to extend that work into a kind of global frame and the ways in which Fanon got recentered in the problem there, but potentially Latin American Marxisms could have done a different kind of work, like Maria Tegue and others who have dealt with the long and persistent question of, how to think about indigeneity and other frames and questions of inequality within a Marxist formation. That is, what can we learn from each other on this panel, right, in terms of trying to move this conversation forward, just to be very succinct. Mm-hmm. One final comment, I think new work on multi-species justice might also get us out of this kind of human, centric, agentic problem that Vera, you're pointing to. Thank you both.
Well, it's pretty obvious that for Latin America in particular, being a continent that didn't used to be European or North American, from the Anglo-North American perspective, there is a lot to learn from the traditions of indigenous knowledge in science, in knowledge of the earth, in knowledge of dynamics, in knowledge of time, in knowledge of history, in knowledge of the lessons that you draw from all those things. And actually, that work is there. It could be done more, but that work is there. The problem is the marriage. And in that sense, where Wallerstein would propose the reunification of the disciplines of the social sciences and of the hard sciences, back to their pre-19th century and late 18th century divergence, I would also, if he were in the room, I'm pretty sure that he would say, yes, and the extension and realliance of knowledge has to also extend to forms of knowledge that are not born in the Western tradition, and are not born in the European and sort of global North. By global North, I'm not including indigenous peoples because I refer mostly to capitalism, basically. So I think that the knowledge flows have to be far broader than, and this for many reasons. I mean, I'm not really big on philosophy, but there are many essential ways in which you mentioned corn. Well, in our knowledge of the historical evolution of social and environmental relationships, it's super important to understand what the genealogy of corn is within societies and between societies. And in order to be able to understand, for example, or explain the process of what that is happening now in Mexico, of the mass loss of genome in indigenous corn, which is going hand in hand with the retreat of indigenous economies and indigenous sovereignty over resources. So I think that they're part and parcel. And what I'm not sure about how to answer is what could critical studies do for us. And that's partly because I actually don't know what critical studies is.
Critical indigenous, I refer to U.S. indigenous critique. Sorry.
Oh, okay, that's different. Okay. I have to think. I don't want to blurt something half-baked. Not that everything I've said so far is not half-baked.
I want to answer, but I think we have to move on in the questions, but maybe we could talk.
We could take a
later.
cluster of questions. What do you think?
That's right.
Oh, that's a good idea, yeah.
That sounds great. Claire and then Mark.
So I'm going to try to be even briefer than what I had planned, which is hard to do because these were very thought-provoking presentations, both of you, and I'm actually glad to see that both of you asked this question that was very much on our mind in the organization of this. Well, two sets of questions. One about questioning or contesting the very category of environmental humanities. I'm really glad that you approached this question, Vera. And also the question, this idea that we are in an unprecedented crisis, right? This narrative that's so common in these, right? And so you're really contesting that idea of unprecedented by asking unprecedented to whom, right? Exactly. Human and among human and beyond human, which is how, that's why I opened the conference with this question. And so in that spirit, I want to ask about how, like, for both of you to speak to one another perhaps about the question of temporalities. Because in both of your presentations, Vera, you talked about le longue durée a lot. And Kyle, you talked about cyclical time and dystopia and spiraling time and getting out of settler fantasies. And so I guess my question to you both is, what does it look like to envision, experience, imagine alternative temporalities that could respond to the problems that you both are posing so wonderfully and critically?
Shall we take Mark's question as well, and then you can elaborate on a combination? Okay.
So this is for Kyle. So every time I hear you or read your work, paradigms are unsettled, and I'm grateful for that. So you missed my presentation yesterday on Du Bois and racial environmental justice. But as I was preparing for that, I asked my partner about, Du Bois talks about the rape of African-American women, slaves, and the rape of the land. And I said to my wife, I said, should I mention that without being able to unpack that? And she said, no, don't. But actually yesterday, in the moment of it, I thought I wanted to honor Du Bois's intuition that was the appropriate way to describe the exploitation of these women and the land. And then today, in the context of consent, you talked about sexual violence and violence against the land. And you know, I understand in terms of this idea of consent and with interpersonal and respect for people, and then in this interpersonal relation and respect for the land, that why shouldn't these two forms of violence be in some ways related? But I want to honor that, and I want to honor Du Bois, but I still feel this discomfort in somehow maybe eliding these two forms of violence. So anyway, I'm just wondering, you know, if you have any particular perspective on that. Is there a way to honor both forms of violence, but also recognize, I don't know, maybe some distinctions between them?
Are there more questions that we can capture before we have our last round? Marley?
there are two, actually.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Hi. So this is sort of building off of, I'm sorry, Claire's question about temporalities, namely that I saw sort of, Kyle, in your work, being struck by the sort of communal and the consent dynamic, and in Vera, your very brilliant way of sort of tackling the temporal problem. And to me, these seem to both be striking against sort of the elephant in the room, which is this sort of conception and environmental, conception and environmental history or environmental activism, that there's a certain kind of human, there's a certain kind of human with certain kinds of rights. I would suggest perhaps from an Enlightenment framework, but maybe it's coming from other places. And I was wondering if you guys could both comment on sort of how perhaps the field of environmental history, environmental humanities, might actually help us complicate or build on a different conception of what it means to have rights from a very separate tradition, from sort of the European tradition. Because that, to me, seems like a very key way of making environmentalism a powerful way of challenging sort of these broader hierarchies. So thank you.
Estrida?
Okay, I'll keep it very brief, and I understand you might not have time to answer all of these. But Vera, I was very taken with your interest in field formation and how sort of our preoccupation with the new and shiny field has a way of sort of eliding previous scholarships and traditions. And sort of building on that, I actually wanted to ask you, Kyle, if you wanted to comment a little bit on how the new and shiny field of environmental humanities, its relationship to Indigenous scholarship, and your thoughts on that.
All right.
Shall we have most of them are for you.
Sort of.
Well, you can both talk about temporalities first, to go back to Claire's point. Time.
Time.
Short
Okay,
time, dystopian
temporalities.
time, long time.
Alternative temporalities, how would that be? I don't know if they're alternative as opposed to superimposed. I mentioned that I think in geologic, evolutionary, and historical time, and those have different dynamics. There are processes in human history that are truly insignificant, or actually all processes in human history, except those that modify the Earth itself, are insignificant in geologic time. And for me, that is a way of actually thinking about this issue of crises being unprecedented and of catastrophe. And when you look beyond the human scale and the temporal scale of human time, actually, geologically, there are no catastrophes. And neither is anything unprecedented. I mean, from the very physics of the foundation of the universe and the dynamics of that physics and how it's reproduced in every single natural mechanism that we have on this planet and on the stars and everything, there's nothing unprecedented. Everything is a reworking, recombination, and recycling of previous processes and elements and forces. So the other temporal framework that I used to think is the evolutionary. And in that, I use that framework in order to also contextualize human action and to understand human action as not always the product of our consciousness and not always a product of our own agency. And in order to actually diminish and put in its proper place human agency relative to the agency of all other things that evolved in our same ecosystems. So for me, evolutionary time also helps me understand the current concerns that humanity has and that our different civilizations have as absolutely temporary and as absolutely a blip in time that will not matter in 100 years, 200 years, and did not matter 1,000 years ago or in different cultural contexts. So for me, thinking in those different frames allows me to kind of dehumanize, in a way, my understanding of the world and of the universe and the relationships between them and what matter is and what forces are and how they work together, and time. What was the other question?
The Enlightenment.
Yeah. the origins of rights and the how to think about rights and what they mean and where they come from. Actually, it's before the before the Enlightenment, and I'm thinking, especially when we're thinking about human rights, I'm thinking about the 1520s debates in Spain about the nature of indigenous populations in the Americas and their rights, and the ways that the Crown sided on that debate versus the conquerors and the actual settlers who were in the Americas. The Francisco Vitoria debate, I mean, with Sepúlveda, about the humanity of the Indians and about the inherent rights of peoples, be they indigenous or not. So I think that, you know, the genealogy of rights is, and I'm not familiar enough with medieval thought or antiquity, and far less with indigenous thought, to understand what rights, how rights were constructed in those contexts. So I don't know. But I actually, I find it really difficult to think through rights. Probably because I'm anti-enlightenment, and I think that we have been misserved in many ways by all that, but also because rights are tied to morals, and I have a really hard time with morals in analytics. Not necessarily because I purport to be objective, but because morals leads us to categorizations of things being good or bad, just or unjust, productive or unproductive, or whatever. And those are characterizations, they're not explanations. So to me, morals leads to judgment, but not to the understanding or explanation of processes, which is why thinking in terms of rights makes me equally uncomfortable. But not to the extent of making me uncomfortable enough to reject human rights as primordial in the earth. I don't think our rights are above those of the rest of the planet, not even above the rights of bacteria. By that, I don't mean some kind of radical ecologist thing, but I don't think we're supreme. We shouldn't be supreme. If our civilization goes to hell, well, so be it. I don't care.
Something to add?
Yep.
Well, yes.
Yep. So I have to start. I have to start a bit earlier to respond to your question. So that's a fantastic question, and one that I haven't thought or dealt with like formally in my work, but I have a lot of ideas and emotions about it, because I think it's very important to what we're doing within Indigenous scholarship today. So one of the first things is people oftentimes forget that one of the disruptions of colonialism was precisely to mess up diplomatic relationships that were much more continental in nature. I mean, you mentioned a genealogy of corn. You know, that's an example of that at one scale, but then if we look at trade networks and other types of relationality that occurred, they were very different from what we think of today, which is like the isolated tribe that may be part of a treaty organization, you know, and have formal political relationships. And obviously in the US and Canadian context, we have these bizarre tribal membership rules where you can only be enrolled in one tribe at one time. And, you know, so we've come a long way in a bad sense from those histories of diplomacy. And so for a lot of Indigenous scholarship in North America, we're actually figuring out what it means to reconnect those ties. And I liked what you mentioned. It's both our, or what I read off of one of the things you mentioned was that it's not only our different, say, Indigenous traditions, but the different ways in which we interpret our non-Indigenous interlocutors, you know, like, say, Fanon or people like that. But one of the things I find that's tricky about the discussion is the difference in Indigenous people's situations. A lot of North American, but also to a degree Pacific critical Indigenous scholarship is, you know, identifies what to many people see as good things like tribal sovereignty, you know, or the, Waitangi Treaty Council or things like that as positive, are actually quite problematic forms of entrenched power. You know, tribal sovereignty is largely on a corporate model where tribes are organized like corporations. Mm-hmm. Whereas when I've gone to Latin America or engaged in some of my UN work with Latin America, one of the primary issues they're dealing with is human security, like will indigenous leaders be assassinated? And autonomy. That's a good point. And what does that mean? Because Native people in North America also will say things like autonomy and so on, but what does that look like? And are we in a position to actually have those discussions? And at the United Nations level, I've been part of a group called the UN Institute for Training and Development, and they have an Indigenous peoples diplomatic training, and depending on where you're from, you are trained in either one of two tracks. One is for countries where the dominant language is Spanish, and so all of essentially Latin America is in that training, and then it's everybody else who probably has access to English language in that training. And so there's that separation, right, which doesn't necessarily correspond to geographic separation. And so anyways, but I have a lot of other things to say about that, but similar to that first question about corn, there's many things I can unpack with this, but maybe we can talk later too if you're still here. So going on to some of the other points. So in connection with your question, some of the points you made, so I've tried to talk about from an Indigenous perspective, though I can't remember if I've written this directly, but so Native people are perfectly okay with the idea that we could be as human beings just completely going away. I mean, I always get a joke out of watching some of these recent science fiction movies in Hollywood, where at the end of the day, the reason why people want to colonize Mars or something like that is to like save the species. Yeah, Native people actually, I mean, this is kind of a weird, is that what Elon Musk actually, a lot of Native people, Mars. Yeah, and I'm just getting this from, personal discussions and things that are just out there in Indian culture, are perfectly okay with this human species, going away. That's just something that could happen. And in that sense, right, what we're doing is thinking about, if we were to find out that human species extinction is inevitable, right, what are you trying to do now? And so in some of the early work that I did on Ojibwe hunting with my friend Nick Rio, one of the persons we interviewed, actually, his emotional life was consumed by the fact he felt so bad that as a deer hunter, that deer couldn't consume him. And he'd actually been strategizing about ways to think about how, when he dies, he might actually benefit, deer in some way. And so that idea of thinking about what your ethical responsibilities are when you're not actually prioritizing species preservation gets at, I think, some of the differences and nuances of Indigenous thought, and actually what something like non-anthropocentrism might mean to different Indigenous groups. It also allows us to draw attention, and I thought this was a theme in your work, Professor Candiani, that you presented earlier, that for a lot of Native people, if you're not obsessed with the unprecedentedness of the environmental catastrophe or even of a future crisis, then you're attending to things that are actually happening right now. And so I've tried to turn on its head is the idea that, Native people are always perceived as being obsessed with the past, but actually what it is a hyper-obsession with present conditions, colonialism, capitalism, industrialization, because we're not, overly concerned about the unprecedentedness of the future, so we're not spending intellectual energy on that, right? Yeah, right. No, I absolutely agree. And so anyways, and I think this, just to segue into some of the other, discussions about time and rights. So one of the, and I think this too, going back to your question, I think is interesting about what do Native people think about rights? At one scale of philosophical analysis, it's absolutely true that rights don't necessarily come out of Indigenous intellectual traditions. The fact that Indigenous people talk so much about rights is a symptom of domination. Though it's also true that you do have rights regimes within Indigenous intellectual traditions that are not seen as the dominant ones. The same way that a lot of Indigenous traditions can perfectly handle private property, as nobody thinks that private property is as fundamental as it is in some other cultures that we know about. But so some of the really important literature, I think, is actually looking at how Indigenous people originally encountered rights doctrines. And so Heidi Stark has really good work on the history of Native treaty relations, where what she looks at is not what the treaty says, but what was recorded about what happened during the treaty deliberations. And as oral people, that was the treaty for Native people. And that, and this is in other contexts outside of North America, is that actually Native people very much saw the treaty relationship as symbolizing much more diplomatic, moral, and adaptive relations that would support coexistence, and thought that the document was just something to, as a nice gesture, right? You go with what we're doing and we'll go with what you're doing. And historically, groups like the British and the French during the fur trade time actually did try to imbricate themselves within native kinship structures as their diplomatic strategy. It wasn't until we get to the US that we get the introduction of sexism and just a complete ignoring of any attempts to indigenize their diplomacy. And so a lot of native treaties, people later in the 20th century were shocked when the US was like, oh no, actually the only thing in the treaty is just that document. And if you look at the document, it's pretty limited, right? It's like if, it's like being misquoted. If you quote something I said in the talk as without talking about this experience we just shared and clarifying things, right? That's pretty offensive. And so I think looking at those histories is actually a really good way to understand how Native people thought about rights. They were things they thought could be useful and wielded in certain ways. The other thing I'll say about rights too is that what people forget as well, and this comes out in treaty relations, is that for a lot of tribes with treaties, the power of a right is not its sort of philosophical moral definition as a constraint on action. The power of a right is that we know that that's a moral principle or moral instrument that matters to somebody else and actually protects a space of ignorance where we know we don't have to disclose to them what we're doing. And so a lot of treaty rights, as long as you have the right, you can do whatever you want in that area. And so this is why climate change is actually scary, because one of the downfalls of rights is that they're oftentimes fixed and not flowing. So if you're engaging in a cultural practice, right, that the dominant society doesn't want you to engage in, if warming or changes in precipitation push certain plants and animals outside of the right's boundaries, then in order to not be hunted down for engaging in certain practices, you'd have to tell the dominant society what you're doing. And so you're moving out of ignorance, their ignorance, right, and into a space where you have to justify what you're doing. And there's almost no way to justify certain types of sovereign practices. And so I think that's an example of what, happens with rights. It's not that they're absolutely wrong from a Native perspective. It's just that people have forgotten that the diplomatic context in which their kind of hegemony emerges within Indian country. So anyways, thanks for that. Thanks for that question. And just finally so I completely agree, and this is what I would agree with, right? So when we say that they're like sexual violence and environmental violence are entangled, so there's a couple of things that when we say that we'd want to avoid, right? So for example, me being male and privileged in different ways, like I wouldn't want to say that my emphasis on environmental justice somehow also uniquely situates me to speak about certain types of threats or experiences of sexual violence. So I think one, that's important. But another thing is important too is in discussions of sexual violence, and the US unfortunately is a bad example of this, is that the high rates of sexual violence, including high levels of rape against Native women, can't actually be understood in terms of the mechanisms without understanding the sort of land and sovereignty issues that give rise, right? So in the US in the 70s had another scheme, right? The tribes would turn into states and have, their own sort of state-like jurisdictions that, there were a lot of great benefits to that for tribes, right? But one of the things the US immediately came down on in the courts was that you wouldn't have criminal jurisdiction over non-Indians.
Peachy.
Yeah, right. And so this is why, people like Sarah Deer, but, many others as well, when they have written about these, histories of non-Indians, performing these horrendous acts of sexual violence with impunity, legal impunity, and then realizing that the same reasons for non-natives to have impunity is related to also bad environmental behaviors also having impunity. you wouldn't want to collapse the two problems, but you wouldn't want to talk about them entirely separately. Yeah. So anyways, thanks for your question.
I believe we need to take a break. I'm so sorry to stop with this conversation, but please seek our speakers in the aisles over the coffee break to continue if you have further questions. And please join me in thanking Kyle and Vera for a very kind of thought-broadening couple of talks.